a behavioral expert who takes executives on expeditions? My guest this week is Erik Vermeulen from South Africa, who helps us understand the ideal conditions to unlock potential.
Welcome to Self-Leadership to Potential-ize with Andrew Bryant. We'll explore the power of potential and the promise of self-leadership. Join Andrew, a global leadership expert and author, as he shares insights, strategies, and stories spanning 25 years and 40 countries. Together, we'll unlock what makes us human, harness technology wisely, and step boldly into the future of leadership.
So I'm really excited to have you on this podcast, Erik Vermeulen. And I probably said that wrong, but you can always correct me. The reason I wanted to talk to you is obviously your work as a behavioral economic strategist, and you can explain to the watchers and listeners what that is. But your history in terms of taking people on expeditions and adventures to challenge their potential. Obviously, with my interest in potential, that's the question. You're a fellow speaker, a fellow author, and you've used your experience from adventures to help corporate teams to reach their potential and to perform. So over to you. Tell us, what do you want to tell us about, how do we understand who you are and what it is that you do?
Andrew, thanks very much. I mean, it's an absolute pleasure to get to speak to your audience and just share these insights with you in preparation for, the book that you're working on. But really, I think what's exciting about what I do, and most people kind of question whether it's really a job, but I get to see people in really extreme circumstances and how they respond to those. And often they would have voluntarily put themselves in those situations. But how they respond to that is incredibly telling in terms of how they respond in business, in life, and how they post-expedition use the expedition experiences to deal with challenges often very differently. And it's exciting to see that even though I'm an expert in behavior, people still surprise me on expeditions. And, that's the kind of stuff I'm hoping we're going to delve into in the next couple of minutes to see how we can maximize potential and how pressure and stress often either reveals greatness or crushes it.
Well, I think that is the $64,000 question is, what are the optimum conditions to reveal one's potential? I've often said to my audiences when I've been speaking that I would never wish adversity upon anyone, but neither do I wish it not, because it's often through our adversity that we discover who we really are and what we're capable of. So perhaps we could just start with a story, just to give us a sense of, adventure, expedition. We've all got a picture in our mind. Give us an example of an extreme condition where somebody stepped up to their potential, for instance. Can you let's just make it real with a case study. You can erase names or you can leave the names in. It's up to you.
We often try and protect the identity of the innocent, right?
Yeah.
I think what the one trip that really stands out for me is a Kilimanjaro climb. And for a lot of people, Kilimanjaro doesn't really present a massive challenge. Particularly in Africa, we tend to think that it's in our backyard, so we'll just go and do Kilimanjaro on a whim. Point is, it's a 6,000 meter summit or 5,900 meters, which makes it a substantial challenge. And I took a school group, high school students, secondary school students between the ages of 14 and 17, the majority of them, on a trip. And one of the first girls to sign up to this, on the first evening, getting to our first hut, kind of put me in the corner and said, "Look, I hate you. You and my mother forced me to do this. I hate this. Can I go back?" And I was sort of taken a bit by surprise because, as I said, she was one of the first people to sign up. And I said to her, "Well, firstly, I didn't force you to come. Your mom didn't force you to come. You signed up for this because you wanted to do it." And there is a backstory in that she signed up for the trip because her father had passed away 18 months before, and it was his dream to climb Kilimanjaro. So when this was presented to her, this challenge, she signed up without, I suppose, a lot of forethought in terms of what this challenge would entail. But after that first evening, where she was really down, really negative, not embracing the challenge, we had a bit of a chat, not much more than what I just revealed. But from the next day onwards, every single day, she was one of the first people in the line as we were climbing the mountain. Did she continue to bitch and moan? Yeah, absolutely. But it got less and less as the expedition moved forward. She was one of the first people to summit. She was one of the strongest people in the team on summit day. And I think it's such a great example of how someone signs up for something, not actually realizing what they're letting themselves in for, become completely overwhelmed on day one, and then finds it within themselves to slowly but surely overcome the challenge as they move forward.
Well, that's an awesome story, Erik. And I think if we can just unpack that a little bit. So we're often thrown into adversity and we're like, what the bleep is this? I'm out of here. But we find it within ourselves. Obviously, my curiosity of what those factors are. You mentioned that, she'd lost her father, right? In your conversation, did that meaning and significance of doing something over and beyond herself, did that kick in, or was it something else?
Her main motivation prior to the expedition was to honor her father. And in her mind, fulfilling his lifelong dream that he couldn't fulfill was a way for her to kind of reconnect with his memory. And that was her primary motivation. It's interesting because the motivation somehow seems quite selfish. And, one of those things that I found in extreme environments is that often when people have a motive beyond themselves, like raising funds for a charity by doing something extreme, they show more endurance. They push beyond themselves more than someone who does something for a selfish reason. But her apparent selfish reason to do this to honor her father actually then allowed her to push herself beyond. Because I think we all have this innate need to not let other people down, particularly people who are close to us. And it's so interesting that she didn't want to let herself down. More so, she didn't want to let her mom down. But even bigger than that, she didn't want to let her dad down. Even though he passed away, in her mind, in her psyche, he was still very much part of her life and still is. And so that allowed her to push through. The other thing that was really interesting is I think her positioning deliberately every day by walking at the front of the group, just behind one of my lead guides, also helped her in overcoming the adversity. Because when you walk at the front, people assume, or people kind of thrust the leadership role on you. Often people look at leaders for the example on how to behave. And even though she was one of the youngest people, aged 14, that really helped. The third thing I think that was really important is how we use our network or relationships to reach our potential or to allow us to step beyond what we think is possible. And she's not the most athletic person, but she had her bestie, her girlfriend, who'd also signed up, who was walking beside her or just behind her every day. She's an athlete, a cross-country running champion, and super strong. And it was so interesting to observe the dynamic between the two of them and how they would help each other, particularly the athlete would help this individual or this girl to reach beyond what she thought her potential initially was. So it's around the motive, assuming leadership, and then finding the support within a network that allows you to reach beyond what you initially believe is possible.
So we have a hypothesis here that to realize our potential, we have to tap into a meaning outside of ourselves or greater than ourselves. That if we step into a leadership position, we then kind of have to live that leadership position. That having a network or support structure of friends also will help us to reach our potential. So that's the hypothesis. And then we'll have a look at some other examples and see if this hypothesis holds up. Before we go there, the counterintuitive point, in my self-leadership work, I say, self-leaders don't blame, complain, or play the victim. But I'm theoretically a self-leader, but I'm British, so I have a PhD in complaining. We British, we complain about everything. But as you know, I might complain, but I'll still go and do it. So it seems that this was an example of, people with potential they're not necessarily completely stoic and keep it within themselves. they will still articulate their disgruntlement, for want of a better word. Have you seen that in other examples, right? Using the using the bitching, as you called it, to get you through.
There was another incident on Aconcagua where I had the CEO of a major insurance company and his son climbing with us. So Aconcagua, 7,000-meter peak, highest peak outside of Asia, and the highest peak in the southern hemisphere or the western hemisphere. So the beauty with Aconcagua is if you summit, you're 99.9% chance of being the highest person standing on the planet. No one else is above you except in an aeroplane, because not too many people climb the northern hemisphere peaks in winter anymore. But so now I've got the CEO of this insurance company and his son. So he is a traditional business leader. He's also done a couple of Ironman. I mean, this guy in the dictionary under overachiever, there's a picture of him. And we get to the park gate of Aconcagua, and we're finalizing our permits. And all of a sudden, the official at the registration desk picks up that this kid, the 15-year-old, doesn't have the correct documentation in terms of, call it for want of a better word, a permission slip from both his father, who's with him, and his mom. So they just won't issue his permit. Now, we'd never had that happen before. Our ground operators in South America had never experienced that before. But now all of a sudden, there's this issue. The authorities won't let this kid climb the mountain. So it was so interesting to observe this CEO and how upset he got. And South Africans go from 0 to bitch mode in 5 seconds flat. And so despite his leadership position in business, despite his emotional intelligence that one assumes someone has who ascends to that position, despite everything he knows, this guy became really irate, upset, in a manner that became unconstructive. And it took a fair bit to actually, for all of us, or for me to get him to kind of step back, calm down, and look for a rational step-by-step solution to the problem, which we eventually got to. It took another day or two, but it was so interesting to see how a leadership style completely changed under huge pressure, how resilience really fluctuated, how there was a lack of managing stress in a constructive way, just in that moment. Once we'd kind of stepped back from that, we found the solution. It took another day or two, but the expedition went ahead, and both him and his son summited at the end of the expedition. But very interesting to see how easily high performers who meet and exceed their potential and instill that in their environment can actually be derailed by something unexpected.
Well, I think that makes me feel better slightly that occasionally I lose it over this.
But, come back to, is it okay to throw our toys, to dump our bucket? Yeah, absolutely it is. I think it's so important. And we see it in high-performing sportsmen as well, that they need that release to dump their bucket. You can't just keep that in and remain what we would call self-controlled throughout. I work with a couple of international cricket players, and in that high-performance environment where when you're batting or when you're bowling, there's an enormous amount of focus on you as an individual, even though it's a team sport, that the pressure that builds up by having to continually be self-controlled and appear to be in control becomes debilitating. And in 2020, I was involved in an expedition where I walked 800 kilometers in just over 12 days as part of a reality TV series. And I took some international retired sportsmen with me on 200-kilometer laps. And at one point, the lady who headed up the marketing for this whole reality TV series and the concept came to me. She said to me, "Erik, why do you not suffer like everybody else?" And I said to her, "But I suffer as much as anybody else does." As I said to her, "As you're speaking to me now, I'm in constant pain." She says, "Well, could you at least why aren't you showing it? And I didn't actually realize up until then how fairly stoic, I suppose, in a way I'd become when things get hard. And it's because I'm so often in a leadership role in difficult circumstances that my perception is that if I allow my clients to see that I'm in as much distress or pain as they are, that would weaken the trust they have in me, which probably isn't a very good way to look at it. And it's probably fallible. But the fact is, I believe that by appearing to remain in control, I instill higher confidence and I instill higher potential in the people that I lead. So I said to Michelle, I said, look, I'm in as much pain. I'm just not showing it. She said, well, for the sake of TV, could you at least show it? And I'm not sure if I succeeded in that afterwards, right? But
yeah, it's not got TV. So there's a little interesting paradox here that when we're in a leadership position, in terms of your first story of a 14-year-old girl, when she stepped into the leadership position, we tend to morph into that identity. Well, we're the leader, therefore we cannot show weakness. But at the same time, that intense stress is going to put you into a scenario where you're going to throw your toys out of the pram at some point. I think we can talk about safe places to throw your toys out, because obviously we don't want to be abusing somebody else with as we throw those toys out. I'm curious, the CEO and his son, once the paperwork was sorted out, was he then a model of leadership and pushed forwards to the top, or did he continue to complain?
It wasn't even a case of once the permits were sorted out. It was literally about 10 minutes later, once we'd managed to get him just to step away and be less emotional about the events, that he kicked into problem-solving mode. And along with myself, we went through a whole process to actually solve the problem, which involved contacting, his wife in South Africa and getting documentation done and through the courts, etc., which was a heck of a process. But it kind of demonstrated that once he regained control of his emotions, his potential as a leader, his potential as a problem solver immediately emerged again. And we got the problem solved within 2 days. But literally 5 or 10 minutes after the initial dump the bucket and explosion, this guy was back to himself, back to being in control and managing his environment as opposed to his environment managing him. And it was an absolute joy, the rest of the expedition.
So that is a matter of reinforcing the strategy to step back from the trigger before you can be strategic.
Yeah. And
so
also,
go ahead.
It's also just important to look at that in terms of how we then can, once we step back and we realize that in order to maximize our potential, a lot of our life is around solving problems. And, that ties into resilience. If you're not resilient, you can't solve the problem. But equally, if you can't solve problems, the most resilient people in the world, if you can't solve a problem, that begins to chip away at your resilience. And we did some research in the early 90s in terms of how adventure experiences influence the way you look at life and whether it empowers you or disempowers you. And what we found is that, so we exposed university students to 2 adventure activities. One was abseiling and what's called and a zip line, where you hang onto a pulley and you speed down a cable. And we compared their experience in that to rock climbing. And what we found was that the students actually experienced rock climbing as more intense and more empowering than sailing and zipline. And when we dug into that, we realized that it had a lot to do with the locus of control. Whereas, so if I'm abseiling or ziplining, all I have to do is hold on, because gravity does the rest. And I have very little input into me completing the activity successfully. But rock climbing, on the other hand, relies a lot on the participants skill in order to climb a rock face. Even though all the safety systems are in place, it relies on skill, it relies on processing risk, and we feel empowered by doing that. And it speaks a lot to how we need to position adventure experiences in terms of giving people a locus of control. So when I'm taking teams, often teams of strangers who meet each other once or twice online or once or twice in person, and then we get thrust into an expedition, how we are able to balance our skill with our experience becomes critical. Because if we expose people to an adventure that has higher risk, significantly higher risk than their skills and experience, they would experience misadventure. And
Well,
in order to
that experience. I mean, isn't this a case of overwhelm, right? So if the challenge is significantly greater than the skill set, there's going to be overwhelm, and obviously, if it's the other way around, there's just boredom, right? So there must have to be this window of optimum challenge, right?
And what I find is when the expedition is overwhelming, the participants begin to rely more and too much on me for their success.
Right.
Which also creates a very odd dynamic. And when they then relinquish that locus of control onto a leader or onto me as the expedition leader, if they then don't realize their potential, then it becomes an excuse and a cop-out. And yes, but it's your fault that I didn't summit or didn't achieve my potential. But when we keep locus of control within, now not achieving my potential doesn't become an excuse. Now it becomes a growth opportunity.
Yeah, that's absolutely spot on. Keeping that. So potential is always about keeping that sense of ownership, locus of control, agency, being the driver rather than the passenger. Correct?
Yeah. And so in our expeditions, I do a lot of work up front in preloading our trips with our clients to enforce the fact that they are always in control. I just provide a structure or an opportunity for them to experience something that they haven't experienced. But by empowering them as much as possible through knowledge, through experiences, through meetings and conversations, I leave a lot of the decision-making up to them. You know, on our desert hike, where we hike about 170 kilometers over 7 days through Rab al Khali, the desert in the Middle East, every morning I actually present the team with a satellite photograph and a little pin of where our camp is, where we currently are, and a pin of where our camp will be tonight. And I leave it up to them to plot our route between these 300 meter high sand dunes and linking Sabka's salt flats together. That immediately empowers them. And it creates a completely different experience as opposed to them just simply following somebody else.
Well, that's genius. I mean, obviously, the exercise in decision-making and ownership is powerful, which brings me to my segue question, which I've just been dying to ask, which is, does this have a knock-on effect? 6 months, 12 months down the track to people who have voluntarily signed up for what my wife would call this, masochism. She would ask, who's going to pay me to do this? But people actually pay to put themselves in extreme conditions. We should backtrack to their motivation to making the decision in the first place. But let's just begin with the end in mind. Is there, a fantastic experience and something you can show photos and tell people stories about, or is there a life change from stretching the comfort zone and realizing that you can do more than you believe that you can do?
What we're finding is there's an absolute link to that, in so much that 87% of people that have done an expedition with us actually report to feeling that and I'm going to read it from the survey that we did. Do you feel that your adventure experience has influenced your approach to setting and achieving personal or professional goals? 86% of people go, it absolutely has. It has had a significant influence on how they see challenges, how they see goal achievement post an expedition. And when we then say to them, so you've done something crazy with us now, are you still seeking out? How's your propensity for seeking out challenges changed as a result of doing something that you thought was really, really tough. And again, 66% of respondents go, yeah, absolutely. Post an expedition, I'm now actively seeking out new ways to challenge myself. The converse is actually quite interesting as well, in that 13% of people go, never, I'm never looking for these kind of challenges. And after that reality series in 2020, we had Team Rugby with 3 World Cup winning rugby players on the team that walked 200 Ks with me. And the one guy represented the Springboks South Africa in the 2019 World Cup, which of course we won. And he actually said to me,
South Africa.
Yeah. And of course, and he said to me afterwards, he says, Erik, you got my number? Lose it. Don't ever phone me again. And, yes, there was a fair bit of jest in that, but we also need to appreciate that I think a lot of people will sign up for an adventure experience and not necessarily want to do it again. So for me, it's more important to look at that 86% of people who go, you know what, I've done something adventurous, and I've learned something from that. And yes, having experienced that is setting me up to exceed or to reach my potential in a different sphere of life, where the adventure simply becomes a metaphor for corporate achievement, family achievement, and reaching life potential.
So are people clear of their intentionality when they sign up for your programs? Is it, how hard could it be? Kind of Dunning-Kruger effect, cognitive bias that they think they'll be able to do it, and then suddenly it's a lot tougher than they thought? Or are they trying to prove something? I'm sure there's a sort of a cluster of reasons that you find people sign up for these things.
Absolutely. And, obviously I can only speak for myself and how I lead these trips, but I actually try really hard to front load the trip as tougher than it is. Particularly Kilimanjaro that we go to sometimes twice a year. I will tell people how it's really, 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 really tough, to the point where people say to me, you're not doing a great job at selling this. But even despite that, I came back about a month ago from another trip with a guy who was on that expedition who's really strong. He's a commercial pilot, mountain. We ride our bikes a lot. And he said, well, I want to come and join you on an expedition. He said to me afterwards, he said, this was way tougher than I thought it would be. It definitely is the toughest thing I've ever done. And that for me is a great way to look at it, is that despite me telling you how tough it is, you still find that it's the toughest thing that you've ever done. And I think that is important, to really just stretch our psyche in terms of our potential, because our bodies will last far longer than our mind. In any tough situation, it's your mind that checks out first. In 2016, we had a horrific Aconcagua expedition. Our tents were two of our tents were blown out of Camp 1. We were then stuck in tents for another 2 days. We were stuck in base camp for 3 days with weather. It was terrible, and to the point where on summit morning we barely had breakfast because we'd lost food, and we were now on the mountain longer than we anticipated. So we had far eaten into our emergency rations. So the result of that was breakfast on summit morning was very, very light. Salami, crackers, a bag of blueberry cheesecake, which is just mush that you mix hot water with. And we leave, so summit day, you leave the tent at 5 a.m., having woken up at 3. It's minus 20 outside. We summited around 1 p.m., got back to the tent at 8:30 that evening, went back to sleep, walked all the way down to base camp the following day. And because it was the last day of our permit, we then had a 27-kilometer hike from base camp to the park gate, all on a bag of blueberry cheesecake, salami and crackers, and some snacks. No proper meal for 24, 30 odd hours. Now, if I told you that you're going to exert that amount of energy and effort over a 30-hour period without any substantial food, you're going to say to me, that is not possible. We can't do it. And you're going to give me all the scientific proof why your insulin levels and your glucose levels, etc., won't allow you to do that. And yet you go and do it. And sometimes the numbers lie to us. And when we're in a tough situation, we will look for excuses often if we're mentally not strong, because our body will go far much further than our mind often will. And for me, that's the beauty of it, doing these kind of things to get people to realize their potential. Is it's our mind that starts looking for the excuses long before our body is ready to actually quit.
So a hypothesis that I'm playing with here is imagination, right? So when we project ourselves into the future, as Albert Bandura would talk about self-efficacy, throwing your confidence into the future, we have to imagine what is possible for ourselves. And one of the things that my creative friends, like my good friend Frederick Harron, who is a creativity explorer, talks about is that creativity is sort of imagination executed. And I'm wondering if we never imagined that this was possible. But once it's done, then that imagination is no longer an imagination, it's a memory. And therefore, the ability to imagine what we're able to do is greater. That is the stretching of the psyche of which you speak, correct?
Absolutely. I'm going to quote Nelson Mandela on that, and he was quoted as saying, "It always seems impossible until it's done."
Yeah.
And the danger for me in the society that we're living in now is that element of imagination is being severely constrained. I look at the youth today who are not necessarily reading books. They're stuck in devices, watching videos and short clips and TikTok and whatnot. And I believe that is placing a massive constraint on that, what you call imagination. When I'm reading something, I have to engage my imagination to picture what I'm reading. When I'm watching a movie, I don't have to do that. The director's already done that for me. And I worry that in the next generation, this power of our imagination isn't going to allow young people today to reach their potential. They're already looking for excuses. I've got a 9-year-old twins, and my daughter's a phenomenal runner. Now, while I know there's never been an Olympics for 9-year-olds and there's no national colors for 9-year-olds, she happens to be in the top percentile, the top 1% of athletes in South Africa in middle distance. Her attitude, however, is, I don't need to train. I train with the squad at school and I'm good enough. And it's driving her mom absolutely crazy because she can see the potential. And my daughter's just going, well, I'm good enough. And so her imagination is now constrained by, in my little pond, right, in my school, in my region, in my province, I'm pretty much top of the pile. She doesn't have that vision, that imagination, or that willingness to feel what it could feel like to be better than what she currently is. And I think if we look at like human, if we look at our population, how do we harness imagination to let people experience or reach their potential when it's being discouraged in terms of the media that we consume?
Isn't it ironic that, she's got a dad who's an extreme adventurer, an expedition guy, and here she is sitting in her comfort zone. It brings a little bit of a sort of an ethical question, how much can we force people's potential? I have been asked by an entrepreneur who's a real penchant for, a real desire, passion rather, not penchant's the wrong word, to make a difference in the world. And he was asking me about, how do we identify the potential in like 14-year-olds and just as, obviously if you're looking for basketball players, if they're already 6'2" at 14, that's probably an out. But, in terms of, how do we find the next, Lee Kuan Yew leader at 14? And I said, well, there are some psychological indicators that people are stepping into leadership and that they're resilient and that they're creative. But I have to ask you the ethical question. Should we be hothousing that creativity at 14? Should we be allowing it to evolve? So, as a parent, you're in that conundrum right now, are you not?
Yeah. And I'm all for the evolution of that. Right now, I want my kids to experience the widest range possible of sports, pastimes, interests, hobbies, and then allow them to make the decision. You see, because for me, the very first step in realizing your potential is actually enjoyment. After you need to enjoy that area in which you could excel later. The minute that enjoyment goes away, you cannot reach your potential in. I'm often asked, people say to me, yes, how can you call what you do work? You speak to audiences around the world, you travel, you go to amazing places. The fact is, though, the minute someone pays you to do something, they have an expectation of a result or an outcome, so it becomes work. When I'm taking 10 people up at Concagua, their families, friends are expecting me to bring them home alive with all their fingers and all their toes. That's an immense amount of pressure. So the first thing is enjoyment. Once you experience enjoyment, the next step in reaching potential is effort. And the biggest lesson I want my kids to learn is that nothing worth achieving will come without effort. And so once they enjoy middle distance running, for argument's sake, then they must enjoy putting in the effort in order to achieve the results. And again, I think society is moving in that kind of general way of wanting to experience the joys of success without necessarily the effort that's required. Pop culture is littered with stories like Tiger Woods, I think is a good one. It's well documented. His dad had him playing golf from the minute he could walk. So was that his choice and destiny to become the greatest golfer? Or was it what his dad thought he should be and he forced it onto him? And that could have gone one of two ways, right? One way is Tiger goes, hell yes, I could do this. I'm enjoying this. I love the effort that I'm putting in and I'm seeing the result. But the other way that I think mostly it goes with kids is they just rebel and they go, well, stuff you, I'm not going to do this.
And well, Andre, sorry to interrupt. Andre Agassi is another example of that, because Andre, he burnt out with tennis. I mean, he was actually an early famous success story for Tony Robbins, because Andre was prepared to validate Tony as the person who helped him reconnect with his love of tennis, because he'd hated it because it was his dad's job, right? Or his dad's dream. And he found it again. Sorry, I interrupted. Go on.
No, but that's a great example, because I think now we have two sporting celebrities that actually illustrate both sides that this early identification or early pressure of what your potential could be goes to. So I just want to say the first one, as I say, enjoyment, effort, and then ironically, once we start achieving results, we kind of close that loop back to enjoyment, because it feels great achieving results. But, and I had the potential to play international sport and I didn't, because I had the enjoyment factor early, well, to a degree. But then I never realized the effort that I had to put in. It kind of came too easy to get to, call it international level. And when all my mates were putting in a ton of extra hours, I wasn't, because I was playing at the same level that they were. And I only realized this much later in life. After so I played hockey, and when I stopped playing hockey, I've not picked up a hockey stick since then. Not for a social game, not for an old boys game at my school. Done, nothing. But 30 years down the line, I'm still riding my bike. I'm still climbing mountains, because the enjoyment was there first. That allows us to make the effort. And once we put in the correct amount of effort, then we get the results.
So, I mean, I guess my takeaway from this is that potential is that which we choose rather than that others choose for us. And because, particularly with kids, giving them lots of options so they can choose the enjoyment is clear. I wanted to just segue, because, I mean, sport is just such a great metaphor for stretching ourselves. My background in working as a physiotherapist way back when with sports people. is where I got the interest in potential. But you work as a corporate behavioral strategist. How do we take that sporting metaphor, put it into business? Because business is a marathon every week, right? And you don't get a down season, right? A game of football, rugby, 90, 100 minutes, whatever, it's over and you get some time before training. But corporate, you end the quarter and the next day is a new quarter. So where do you find the crossover? Is it clear, or are there some things that sporting is just stays in sport and perhaps shouldn't be carried over into the corporate world, and there's some things that very much should? Do you have any perspectives on that?
Absolutely. And I think the first one is kind of just latching on exactly what you were just saying, is that there's no off season in corporate. In fact, it only gets worse because, so let's take sport, for example. So African rugby team, the Springboks, have won the World Cup twice, right? So that's it. You've got a 4-year plan, you win the World Cup and it's done. And then you take a bit of a break and the team changes and maybe you win the next one. But winning the World Cup is the ultimate, that's the pinnacle. Now you're going to corporate where it's not a 4-year cycle, it's a quarterly cycle, or actually it's an annual cycle broken down into quarters. So you're going to hit your target at the end of this year. That's the pinnacle. Now, not only next year do you have to meet your target, you have to increase that target, often with fewer resources. Like that's how every corporate in the world is going. And then we wonder why we're battling with resilience in the workplace. Now you're wondering why we're battling with burnout in the workplace. Because every year, so there's no rest period, there's no off season, there's no time to recollect and regroup. And every year, you need to achieve more with less. And that's simply not sustainable from an emotional and a potential perspective. The second thing, I think that doesn't translate. So in sport, you are part of a team, you have a very specific goal, and that goal reflects on you as an individual. In corporate, you never get that individual recognition. Even if you're in a team or if you're an individual athlete, you get to show off your Olympic gold, silver, or bronze medal. What do you get to show in corporate for hitting the target? Your top performers every year in corporate just keep getting promoted or getting more work thrust on them until eventually they are burnt out or they are promoted to their level of incompetence, where they go, I simply don't have the skills to do this. And that is kind of now amplified by the fact that you go to work not for your employer's reasons. You go and work for your own reasons. And if you can't make a very clear connection between the benefits you receive from work and how you apply that in your life, or if your employer can't make that connection and use that as motivation, what's the point of doing it? Because you're not there for your company's reasons. You're there for your own reasons. And you use the benefits that you get from working as a trade-off for your time to invest in your family, your growth, your home, your kids' education, whatever those goals are. And so there's a weak psychological contract between achieving stuff in corporate and how that applies to your own life. And only if you can strengthen that contract do you become successful in life or in corporate. And I think often that's why we see, again, the younger generations moving jobs so often, because they're all seeking for this elusive corner where they can achieve their why. Not to speak ill of certain speakers and stuff in the industry, but
You mean Simon Sinek? Yes.
yes, Simon, why is great. It's altruistic, but it means very little to 99% of people on the planet. People's why for going to work is to pay their bills, put their kids to school, keep a roof over their head. It's very few people are reaching that pinnacle of Maslow's hierarchy of needs of self-actualization. It's all about just meeting short-term goals. And it's the very, very few, that 0.1%, that actually get to self-actualize.
So we've talked about, sorry,
we can't see it.
I cut you short there. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Okay. So it's when
No, you've absolutely stated the problem. We don't have why, we're not self-actualizing. So you've beautifully stated the problem, and I think everybody knows that problem. You did say something that I want to just grab, because you say we need to strengthen the psychological contract for work. We've discussed in terms of adventure, in terms of potential around having fun, setting, own autonomous or locus of control stretch goals, getting some success, re-engaging the fun. Can we use that? Is that what you use in terms of strengthening that psychological contract, or is there something else that we can do? So somebody listening to this, what can I do to strengthen that contract with my employees, to engage them?
The link that I love to make around that is that adventure experiences always involve clear, challenging objectives. It also always involves an element of risk. And by its very definition, adventure is any undertaking of which the outcome is uncertain. So to build that link to potential within corporate is, I think we have to realize that firstly, no matter what your job is, how big your company is, this is an adventure because the outcome is uncertain. It always is. We're tricked into believing that tomorrow is certain through our rituals and routines that we set in our own lives and that our companies set for us. But then we strengthen that by understanding that achieving our potential is a process. It's not an outcome. And so we break down our business goals into quarters, into weeks, into processes. We should do the same for our personal potential and accept that we need to stretch what we think is possible and then break that down into what is that process that could allow us to achieve that. Understanding that if we don't, that's okay too, because life goes on. Business might not go on if we don't achieve our goals, but life goes on. And so we need to just kind of recalibrate, and so it's interesting that Olympic gold medalist, I think he's probably the most successful Olympic swimmer of all time, Michael Phelps. He used a lot of adventure thinking and adventure training to take that into swimming, particularly around dealing with adversity and exactly what we're talking about. Because if you can handle how tough it is at 6,000 meters in a snowstorm, that kind of pales into insignificance when, where your life is threatened, to how tough it might be swimming 100 meters to get an Olympic gold. Lance Armstrong, I think, stated it really well also. He said, pain is temporary, quitting lasts forever. So once you quit in business, in life, you can't ever go back and unquit, right? But that pain that you're experiencing will be temporary and it'll be gone, whether it's in 20 minutes, half an hour, 2 days, a month. At the end of the day, it's gone.
Very good. I think you've summarized it beautifully. And our challenge is to reframe business as an adventure. But this does remind me of the actual origin of the word entrepreneurship. It's from the French entreprendre, which means to undertake a risk. And it used to mean to undertake the risk of a journey. And it was Jean-Baptiste Say, the French economist. I have to say that with a French accent. Jean-Baptiste Say, who turned entreprendre into entrepreneurship. So one of the things I encourage everybody to do is to be an entrepreneur of your own life, is to take that locus of control, take that risk, and set out to do something worthwhile. And this has been a worthwhile conversation. Thank you so much, Erik. There's so much I can unpack from our conversation today. I think this might have to be part 1, and I'll get you back for part 2. But so thank you so much for your time and your insights.
It's a great pleasure, Andrew, and thrilled to be part of creating something fantastic for you to put out into the world. It's an absolute pleasure.
Awesome.
Thank you for joining us on Self-Leadership to Potential-ize with Andrew Bryant. If you're ready to be the driver of your life and not the passenger, keep exploring with us. Get your copy of Potential-ize wherever good books are sold. For more resources or to book Andrew for coaching and speaking engagements, visit selfleadership.com. Until next time, think smart, lead better, and always potentialize your future.